Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about keybinds, and I'm going to try to make this as quick a video as I can. I'm going to start off by saying that if keybinds is not something you're familiar with, it's going to be pretty hard and unfamiliar at first. Obviously, if you're used to using your keyboard buttons to turn your character and just using your mouse to click your abilities, then trying to transition over to keybinding is going to feel super awkward at first. And there's no way to circumvent that. You're just going to have to push through the awkwardness until it starts feeling comfortable. So I am going to give some tips and tricks that I did to teach myself to keybind when I first started several years ago, and what I found most helpful for that awkward transition phase. So to start with, you can see that my UI looks very funky right now. It's kind of all over the place. And I did this on purpose just so you guys could see, I guess in a sort of visual way, how I do my keybinds. So I set up my keybinds on my keyboard in a very grid-like structure. So from the top of the keyboard, starting with 1, 2, 3, 4, those 4 keys, and then going all the way down. So 1, 2, 3, 4 at the top. That would be right here. 1, 2, 3, 4 at the top. And then QWER would be, that's what I use to move and things like that. So W is how I move forward, Q is to strafe left, E is to strafe right. I do not have the turn left, turn right keybound, and I do not have the back pedal keybound. So the only way that I move with my keyboard is to run forward or to strafe left or right with QWE, and then R is how I mount. So that's that first part of the grid-like structure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then QWE to move with R for my mount. Next down the grid-like structure is ASDF. This is where I normally have my key sort of rotational damage abilities. And then at the very bottom of the keyboard, we have ZXCV. Down here, this is where I always put my defensive cooldowns. And then with this grid-like structure, I use Shift and Alt as my modifier keys. So outside of that, I will use Alt 1, 2, 3, 4 for some abilities. This bar, by the way, this whole kind of structure is normally off to the side for me. And then outside of Alt 1, 2, 3, 4, things like that, I have my 12 mouse buttons for my 12 button gaming mouse. This is normally where I put mouse over macros for heals or group utility spells. So let me try and give you a visual breakdown with my handy dandy paint program here and see if it helps a little bit to see this image. So again, as you can see, I just take this grid-like structure of the keyboard, and that's what works best for me. So when I was first learning how to to keybind, I kept the Q, W, E, A, S, D. I kept these as my movement abilities because it was too big of a change for me at first, and I just started keybinding abilities into 1, 2, 3, 4 and ZXCV just because it's so close to where your fingers are naturally going to rest in this, AWSD sort of area. It's so close for your fingers. I immediately keybounded or keybind my mount to the R key because it was just right here. And that was how I started, was very slowly. I just started with this little matrix of keys right here that I wasn't ready to let go of yet, and I started slowly branching outwards until I was ready to let go of the ASD movement keys completely, and I could then use those keys to keybind. It is awkward to teach yourself to keybind when you're not used to it, but I do think that a grid-like structure like this where you don't have keybinds way the heck over the place all over your keyboard does make it a little easier to just get into learning. And once you start getting comfortable with this sort of setup, then you can start customizing your keybinds more to whatever your preferences might be as you evolve and learn and grow. So just to break this down so that it makes even more sense, hopefully, one of the things that I do to help myself, and especially when I was first starting out with keybinding, is I make all of my keybinding buttons the same. So I like to think of these as quadrants, right? This is the top quadrant, 1, 2, 3, 4. And on every single class I play, the 1, 2, 3, 4 abilities are always going to be movement abilities or like if I'm playing a class that can stealth, that's probably always going to be on the 1, 2, 3, 4 keys. So 1, 2, 3, 4 will always be any movement speed abilities, any like jumps, speed boosts, sprint, roll, that kind of thing. And then if I have a stealth class, that will be here. If I'm playing a tank or DPS spec that has healing abilities and has like a the resurrection spells will always be right here. My QWE, like I said, is always move forward, strafe left, strafe right. My R is always going to be my mount. My T over here that I now have keybound is always going to be a group buff or something like that, if I have such a thing. If I don't, if I'm playing a class that does not have group buffs, this is where I would put a different kind of utility mounts, like a vendor mount and things like that. So then moving down, my next ASDF, like I said, this is always going to be my core class damaging abilities. So just whatever the 4 biggest, sort of most obvious damage spells are that your class does, I'm always going to put those right here no matter what class or what spec I'm playing. Even if I'm playing a healer, the 4 main damage abilities of that spec will still always go right here. If I'm playing a tank, same thing. And it just makes it easy for your brain to keep in its sort of long-term memory storage, even if you play a lot of classes, that it doesn't matter what class you play in, you can still always rely on your damaging spells being right here, your mobility spells being right here, and then this last quadrant way down here I always use for defenses. So whatever kind of defensive abilities or keep me alive or off heals the class that I'm playing happens to have, they're always going to be these bottom 4 keys right here. So that's the quadrant. And then we just use, sorry, I didn't mean to highlight caps here, but then we just use Shift and Alt as my main modifiers. So it would be Shift Q, Shift W, Shift E, Shift A, Shift S, Shift D, Shift F, etc. And same with Alt. It would be Alt Q, Alt W, Alt E, Alt R, Alt A, Alt S, etc. So let's go back in game and let me show you how some of this actually works. So now that you've seen this sort of grid-like structure, like I said, I made my action bars kind of weird just so I could kind of visually highlight how it's so grid-like, and it helps me and my sort of mind, I guess, to just always have everything exactly the same no matter what class I'm playing. So the way that my keybinds are normally set up is I normally have my Alt 1, 2, 3, 4 spells over here on the side. And then my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 TRG is my top bar right here. This is always going to be at the very bottom. Right here. Would be at the bottom of the screen. And then my ASDF, where my key abilities are also always going to be at the bottom on top of my 1, 2, 3, 4 bar. And now we get to the final part of the quadrant as far as my sort of core class kit is concerned. And that's my alt modifiers. So you can start to see, hopefully this is starting to make a little bit more sense. You can start to see with my abilities here, if you look at where the 1 is, this is literally just the 1 at the top of the keyboard and then going all the way straight across to the 9, and it ends at 9. And then this keybind right here that's blink is what I have bound to T. Like I said, that's normally group buffs if I have any. If not, it might be a utility mount or it might be blink like it is here. And then R is always for my mount. And then G will usually be for some sort of secondary mount like a water mount or something like that. So this is always this bar. It's always mobility. So you can see the only mobility that this spec has, since I'm playing on a tank spec right now. And then if I have any stealth, again, it will always be this 1, 2, 3 right here. The kind of middle number keys like 5, 6, 7, since those are a little harder for me to reach, is where I put abilities that just are not important. They're not, you can see there's nothing here. There's not usually anything in these keybinds. for me, the way that I do it, it's so awkward and uncomfortable for me to try to reach my fingers over there. And I would, at that point, much rather just drag it over to the side if it's that unimportant. So that's that bottom bar. The middle bar right here is my core kit. So if you remember, I said ASDF is the core damage abilities, and then ZX, CV are my main defensive abilities. Those are all very important things, right? Your main damaging abilities and your main defensive abilities. So I just keep them all in this bar. And then I use my shift modifier to go shift A, shift S, shift D, shift F. So it goes A, S, D, F for the key rotational abilities, and then shift A, shift S, shift D, shift F. So it's the exact same keys that we just hit, ASDF, except for now we're hitting shift to use them as well. And if I'm playing a tank spec, this is where some of my shorter cooldown tank cooldowns would be, like my tanking defensive abilities would be. If I'm not playing a tank and I'm playing a regular damage class, this is usually, these are the keys where my AoE abilities would be, whereas these would be more single target focused abilities. So that's how this is almost always going to look for the way that I have it set up. And like I said, I just like to keep it consistent like that. So I automatically know every time I log onto a tank class that my tanking sort of defensive abilities, so if I'm playing a prot warrior, my shield block, my ignore pain, things like that, all those different kinds of charges and readily available cooldowns are always going to be shift S, shift D, right? My iron skin brew and my purifying brew for the brewmaster monk are shift S, shift D. Same thing for the guardian druid. My iron fur and things like that are always going to be right here in this sort of trio of keys right here. And that way, again, no matter what tank spec I play, I can just from muscle memory put my fingers right, shift S, shift D, shift F, and always know that that's going to be my tank abilities. Or if I'm playing a damage dealer, those are always going to be my AoE abilities. And then again, no matter what class I'm playing, whether it's a healer or a tank or a DPS, my longer cooldown, like big defensive cooldowns, are always going to be these bottom four keys, Z, X, C, V. If I have any off heals available to me, so the Brewmaster, even though it's a tank, still has access to Vivify from the monk class, things like that. If I have any off heals, I'll squeeze it in somewhere in here so that I can heal myself real quick. And that will be this bar covered. Then my top bar, this is cooldowns normally and CC. So the top bar for me is always going to be cooldowns and CC, any sort of utility kind of things like that. So my first two top corner, Alt A and Alt S, since it's super easy for me to reach. I'm a left-hander, I don't know if that matters, but it's just naturally very easy for me to kind of hover my hand. My hand is sort of resting in this kind of general area the whole time that I'm playing. So it's very easy for me to take my thumb from the space bar right here and just slide it right over to the Alt key. And it's not uncomfortable for me at all. Anyways, so this top bar is always going to be Alt A, Alt S will be my two biggest damage cooldowns, or just anything like that, right? So this monk tank class that I'm playing right here is not particularly well geared. I don't have a lot of damage cooldowns and things like that. I just kind of chose guard, which is not a damage ability. It's a defensive ability, but I popped it right here because it has a very short 30-second cooldown, and then the one damage trinket I have right here, I popped over in the corner. So Alt A, Alt S specifically for me will always be my two biggest damage cooldowns. If I'm playing a healer, it will be my two biggest healing cooldowns. If I'm playing a tank, it will be a damage cooldown and or really large tank cooldowns. So that's that. Alt D will always, on every single class, be my interrupt ability. I think it's important to maintain this sort of consistency across every class when you're learning keybinds, because having to learn a whole new set of keybinds for every spec you play or every class you play, I think is what can start to really overwhelm people. So just having this sort of formula for yourself where you're like, okay, these are the keys that are easiest and most convenient for me to always be hitting and touching, so I'll just always make that my core damage abilities, right? Then just sort of setting up a formula, like I said. So Alt D is always the interrupt I have available to my class. If I happen to be playing a spec that doesn't have an interrupt or a silence or anything like that available to it, like a Shadow Priest or something like that, then this ability will instead be some other kind of CC, right? And then all of my abilities right here, moving on to the next kind of quadrant, Alt Q, Alt W, Alt E, this is normally Alt R. These are always going to be CC abilities. You'll see that right here I have this Tiger Lightning spell because I just don't have another CC ability, so this is fine. Yeah, my Shift T right here, this is a lot of different things for me. I don't normally have things over here. This is normally on my tank specs, bound somewhere else right in here, but for now I just kind of stuck it in here just so that there wasn't a ton of blank space. And then up here, the top three abilities in this sort of upper right hand corner are always my middle mouse button abilities. So this is really helpful for any abilities that your class has that places things on the ground. So for, again, this tank spec, I have an ability called Summon Black Ox Statue, so I can click on my middle mouse button and it will pull it out, and I can place it wherever I want without having to click another time or anything like that. So any sort of, so example, like a Destruction Warlock, right? You have the ability that lets you summon your Infernal, right? Where you would need to mouse over somewhere and place it on the ground. And then you also have an AoE ability called Rain of Fire, which you again place on the ground somewhere. All those kinds of abilities are always going to be on my mouse button. So this right here is my middle mouse button. This is Alt middle mouse button. And then this right here is normally Shift middle mouse button, but as you can see, I don't have anything there, but just so you know, you can get an idea, I would Shift middle mouse button and that would use whatever ability I had keybound right there. So like I said, I know that this is going to be a difficult transition for some people if you're not used to key binding, or if you've been using key bindings that are not very comfortable for you. This is what has worked the best for me. I was a keyboard turner for a long time when I first started playing, and it's just a bad habit to get into, I feel like, because the more time you spend keybind or keyboard turning, the harder and harder and harder it becomes to break through the awkwardness of learning how to keybind. So in my opinion, even if you only have a few things keybound that you're comfortable with, it's still better than having literally nothing keybound. I would highly recommend everybody try to get a mouse that has the most buttons, like the most options for key binding that you possibly can. The mouse that I'm using is called UTech. Let me just like find a way to write this out for you guys somewhere. So this is the name of the 12 button mouse that I use, UTech Venus. You can find it on Amazon. It's pretty cheap for a 12 button mouse. It's like 60 bucks, something like that, 50 or 60 bucks. It's a really good mouse. I've had this same mouse for like 5 years and it's still just plugging right along. It's a really good size. It's quite large, I feel like, compared to the Razer 12 button mouse, which was a little too small for me. So yeah, if you guys are interested in getting a 12 button mouse and you have, you know, some money or whatever, look into the UTech Venus. They do go on sale occasionally, so that would be something to look into. But that's the mouse that I use. Even if you don't have a 12 button mouse, even if you can just find something like a 6 button mouse or something that has just a couple of buttons on the side, it will make your life a little easier for things like mouse over macros, just being able to use your, you know, whatever extra buttons your mouse has. Since you're using your mouse anyways to mouse over something for the macro, being able to then use whatever button is on your mouse to keybind for that just sort of makes sense to me. So yeah, I hope that this video was helpful. I am trying to keep it a little short. That means it's not going to be as in-depth, I realize, but hopefully it still gave you enough of the sort of information breakdown for it to make sense. So again, I just do all of my keybinds in this grid-like structure, just straight down the keyboard. So if you can imagine taking your 4 fingers and placing them on 1, 2, 3, 4 and just dragging them straight down, that's pretty much how I do my keybinds, again with Shift and Alt as my modifiers. Ignore the highlighted caps here. So that's how I do it. Like I said, keybinds are something very subjective and very personal for a lot of people. Everybody is going to have their own thing that's comfortable for them based on, you know, what kind of keyboard they're using and what their hand size is and what they're comfortable with. And so, you know, I'm not trying to say this is the only way to do it or that it's the best way to do it. I'm sure it's not. It's just what helped me break out of keyboard turning and what I know for a fact has helped a couple of other people. So if you guys found this helpful, Like I said, even if you're able to start key binding just a few things at a time, I do ultimately think, you know, just slowly dipping yourself into it. You don't have to be like all or nothing about it. Like if you can't keybind every single thing, then you just shouldn't even do it at all. It is still worth it to just start building in that muscle memory, like I said, of getting used to just hitting, you know, your number one button, right? If you have a movement ability, if you're playing a druid, right, and kitty form is, you know, the druid's cat form is the form that you use the most or whatever, just stick that on, you know, keybind it somewhere, put it on 1 or put it on 2 or put it on something else, right? And just start slowly getting yourself used to hitting buttons with your fingers instead of with your mouse and clicking them with your mouse. Um, that would be my advice. So just trying to keep this short and sweet. Like I said, I hope people found this helpful. I hope it wasn't too complicated and confusing, but was still, you know, informative enough for you guys to get the gist and the idea. Once again, for those of you who don't know, to change your keybinds in the game, you hit escape and then you click on keybindings right here. And this is where you can change your keybinds or delete your keybinds for your movement. You can see I don't have turn left, turn right, or move backwards bound at all. And then this is your action bar. This is just your main base UI action bar. And then if you selected to have the 2 action bars over here active, that would be under multi-action bar, as well as the 2 additional top bars that you can have. So just play around with this stuff. You can see where I have all of my mouse keybinds. But just play around with these keybinds and get used to where it's all at on your game screen, which bar controls, you know, which set of keybinds up here, and start, like I said, just keybinding things, you know, just play around, you know, take like a half hour one day or 15-20 minutes one day and just, you know, keybind some, you know, action abilities that you don't normally use, let's say, or somewhere on your action bar that you don't normally use, and just let yourself practice with how it feels to push the buttons with your fingers as opposed to using your mouse and clicking, and start doing it that way. So that's what I would say. This is how you do your key bindings in the game, how you change them. You can select this thing up here to be character specific keybinds, meaning the keybinds that you select will only apply to this one character. Like I said, I really don't recommend that unless you're used to keybinding in a bunch of other games, in which case, you know, I don't know why you're watching this video, but yeah, I do think it's important to maintain some consistency, kind of formula-like thing across all characters and classes, especially when you're just getting started with key bindings. There's no need to make it more work for yourself. So anyways, that's gonna wrap this video up. Let me know if you guys have any questions, or if you need help with anything. There are a couple other guides on YouTube that go more in depth into keybinds as well. So that's it for now. I will see you guys in the next video.